Well, welcome everyone. My name is Dana White. Welcome to a very special Myth Salon. Today we have Dr. Clyde Ford on the first Thursday of Black History Month. And for me, it's kind of sad that we actually need a Black History Month, because if we didn't have race issues, if we didn't have problems of communicating among ourselves through our differences or in spite of our differences, something like that would be completely unnecessary. But as necessary as it is, I'm privileged and honored with my good friend and colleague, Linn, to have Dr. Clyde Ford with us today. So I don't want to lose sight of the fact that today we are still deeply embedded in the coronavirus. It is deeply troubling that we're making our way to 500,000 deaths in the country since the coronavirus began about a year ago. And who knows where this is going. They talk about variants and they talk about vaccinations, but the bottom line is it really appears to me that we have a human condition throughout the world that is not living in balance with the world. And we're living as if we own the world. And I think this has created a problem systemically throughout history, and it's rearing its head today. So with that in mind, I would like to have a moment of silence for all those who didn't make it or who have suffered casualties. I'd also like to give a special sadness acknowledgement to my good friend Vorris, one of our panelists. His mother passed. And I hope it's okay that I shared that, Vorris, in here. I thank you. I love you, brother, and I just, you get one, and when they go, it's what happens. So let's give ourselves a moment here. It's always very special to me what happens in moments of silence when we go into it and we come back out. I want to read you a poem today by a fellow named Dave Harris. It's called After Zuko. Yes, I too have known fire, and yes, I too have wondered if I come from a burnt people, a people who have always been ablaze. I've hated my own hands. I've been prince to a kingdom of folk and dishonored them. I have worn a white mask. I've cut my hair to look less like me. I too have sought to be anything other than the ashes of another man's sin. I've tried to earn my existence in a nation that would not claim me. I've scorched the ones who care most. I've searched the countryside to find something I always had, and yes, I have been unworthy of my own mother's love. I have known the right thing to do and done otherwise. I too have been an exile and a product of my tribe, and yes, I'm still running. I too am afraid of being a good man. I too have been beaten by water, nearly drowned, emerged, and still, I would burn a forest down just to feel the warmth against my skin. So I would like to say, welcome everyone. We're in for a beautiful evening, and let me turn it over to Will. Will?
Thank you, Dana. I'm also honored to host this event tonight. I originally came across Clyde when Dara Marks, who's here with us tonight, pointed me to his book. And I know Connie goes back with you as well. I've been introducing you to my courses on myth and story and philosophy and now anthropology for years. So it's really special to get to be here with you tonight and actually to invite those classes, in this case, anthropology and philosophy classes, to be here tonight. And I'm looking forward to discussing with them afterwards and want to welcome them especially. Um, Before we get started, I also just want to make sure everybody knows that in honor of Black History Month, we've put up the Myth of February content portal on mythhouse.org, which is an introduction to myths of February, to holidays in February, including Sangha Day, which is the community day in Buddhist tradition, but also content portals on Black History Month, African mythology, and the events we have this month. So hopefully y'all check that out, and hopefully you'll check out other events that are on this theme that haven't just been going on in this month. For example, a Vorris event at the end of last year. You can find that on Myth House as well. So um, we've got a lot to talk about tonight, and what I'm most excited about, I've got to say, with Clyde, is when we got together to talk about this event beforehand, what was just so obvious is how naturally it is for you to move between a discussion of like ancient mythologies, a personal mythology, cultural mythologies, and to bring those all into dialogue with one another in a way that enables you to see both mythological prisons and also healing narratives. And I know that that's come through in your work that's been so meaningful to so many people. So again, it's an absolute honor and a privilege to have you. Thank you, Clyde. And now I'd better introduce our wonderful panel. And I'd like to say, it is a lot to introduce and give these introductions to everyone, but I really do believe it's part of what this event is and part of what we're about. And what we are about is bringing together these voices of people from many different backgrounds. So if you'll give me a minute, I'd like to introduce and bring everybody into the room. You all know Dr. Dana White, who's a scholar and author, host of this Myth Salon, and adjunct faculty member at Pacifica Graduate Institute. My name is Will Linn. I lightly moderate these myth salons. My PhD's in myth. I've spent years working for the Joseph Campbell Foundation and building an academic department for filmmakers and performing artists at what is now Husson College. We're also joined by Dennis Patrick Slattery, a mythology scholar, a poet, a longtime professor in myths in Pacifica's myth program, and author of An Obscure Order, Reflections on Cultural Mythologies. We're also joined by Selina Matthews, who's a clinical psychologist and author and keynote speaker who graduated from Pacifica and is an ever-present longtime friend of the Myth Salon. And Zaman Stanizai is also in the bottom right from me, a professor of mythology and political science at Pacifica and Cal State, a poet, a linguist, a mystic, and a Fulbright scholar. I'd also like to welcome and thank Connie Zweig, who helps us so generously to invite amazing guests to this Myth Salon. Connie is an internationally renowned psychologist for her work on shadow, whose books include Meeting the Shadow and Romancing the Shadow. Dr. Vorris Nunley is a professor at the University of California, Riverside, who teaches rhetoric, philosophy, and literature. He's interested in issues of heretical energy, the dark feminine, gendered and racialized knowledge, and the demise of vulnerability. We've also got some special guests with us today. I mentioned Dara Marks. Welcome back, Dara, who is a writer and a leading international script consultant who had devoted the last 20 years to the development of a groundbreaking approach to the theory of the transformational arc and screenplay structure. She also does workshops on the feminine heroic. And this is our first time with Wally. This is me, first time getting to meet you, Wally Mutazamil. And I'm sorry, did I say that correct? I would like to check with you. Thank you. As a CEO and author and a global champion for hope, throughout his work, there's an emphasis on transformational leadership, educating and facilitating for the great responsibility of language and narratives that create realities. He facilitates for WRAP, which is the WRAP, Wellness Recovery Action Plan, and his company, Transformational Development Consortium, works to transform the world. Jennifer Lee Selig is with us again, who's given a Myth Salon, actually did a salon with us on Martin Luther King some time ago, back when we all lived in another world and met in Dana's living room. Jennifer is a lifelong educator of over 4,000 students with 30 years of classroom experience, and her last academic position was at Pacifica Graduate Institute. There she taught depth psychology and the humanities. She continues to offer courses through Pacifica's public programs and memoir writing, and she's a frequent author of newspaper articles, book reviews, journal articles, screenplays, and author of and publisher of over 18 books. including her most recent Deep Creativity, 7 Ways to Spark Your Creative Spirit, which she co-authored with our friend here, Dennis Slattery, and Deborah Quibel. And the man of the hour, finally, Dr. Clyde Ford is considered a major leader in the realm of African mythology. His book, The Hero with an African Face, was described as picking up where Joseph Campbell left off. He writes, I woke up alternately cursing and blessing Campbell. Cursing him because he should have presented African mythology in a much more welcoming light than he did. But his racism blinded him, and blessing Campbell because his failure to do so provided a wonderful opportunity for me. And today we're very lucky to have Dr. Ford here with us to discuss African mythology and its importance for healing our societal wounds. So thank you for being with us, Clyde, and thank you also for joining us, Wally. It's wonderful to have you with us for the first time.
Will, thank you for that introduction. Wow, I feel like I'm with such distinguished people that I should just be quiet and listen. But I want to acknowledge also, Dana, thank you for not just inviting me on, but for doing the Myth Salon and continuing a tradition of people gathering to have important discussions around the topics that you've had. The Salon is a lost literary art, and it's wonderful to see you reinvigorating it in terms of mythology. I couldn't go on without thanking my 2 really dear friends, one of my oldest friends on the planet, and that's Connie Zweig. Connie and I first met when I was leaving a job that Connie was so happy to have, and she thanked me because I was leaving to her, a gift that she couldn't believe. So Connie, thank you for being here, for inviting me here. And then my other good friend, Dara Marks. Dara and I have taught together, and I've learned so much from the work that she does with story. And I really appreciate her being on here with me as well too. So all of you who I know, those of you who I'll get to meet during this discussion, thank you very much for being part of this salon. You know, I thought that maybe a place to really start this discussion would be in a very personal way for me to talk a little bit about how I came to write this book, The Hero with an African Face. And yes, what you heard Will say was true. During the writing of the book, I woke up alternately blessing and cursing Campbell. My fingers scrolled down the same pages that I know his did because I was looking at his quotes, and where his finger stopped, but I'm sure his eyes continued to read. My finger continued, my eyes read, and I wanted to make sure I included many of the things that Campbell could have had he chose to include in his book on mythology, but didn't. But that's not where the story starts. Actually, the story starts some 10 years before the book was published. The book was published in 2000. And I had picked up a copy of The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And I really had attempted, I knew it was an important book, and I attempted to read it, and I didn't make it past the first sentence. And the first sentence begins something like this: whether we listen with aloof amusement to the dreamlike mumbo jumbo of some red-eyed witch doctor from the Congo. And I closed the book at that point saying to myself, if that's all that Campbell can write about African mythology, I'm not sure I could read this book. I think I described that as kind of like my Symplegades, the rocks that the mythic hero Jason had to get through on his way after the Golden Fleece. And in many ways, my first attempt, I didn't make it through those rocks, because on the face of it, Campbell had presented African mythology in such a pejorative way when contrasted to all the other mythologies he speaks about in that first sentence of his groundbreaking work. Well, 10 years went by, and I got a call from a woman at Bantam Doubleday Dale, a very famous editor in those days, Tony Burbank, who's since become a really great friend. And Tony said to me, Clyde, you know, I think there's a book that you're one of the few people I know who could write, and it's a book on African mythology. And I was really floored and quite honored that she would think of me in those terms. And I also had a little bit of fear in the back of my mind because I knew that I would have to go up against the hero with hero with 1,000 faces again. Now, at the time, I was in practice as a chiropractor and a psychotherapist. I did 3 years of postdoc training in psychotherapy. And most of my client population was adult female survivors of early childhood sexual abuse, where we were really working with the nonverbal somatic issues that were so much a part of their healing. I began to get really sensitive, and I thought fairly adept at discovering where an individual was on their own healing journey by listening to the stories they told. And those stories would often clue me into whether they were in a victimization phase of their grappling with this significant trauma, or when they had moved into that empowerment phase. And any of you who have worked with clients know exactly what I mean, maybe even experienced that in your own life, that is the stories you tell about yourself. I think it was Jung who said, and often said to his clients, what's the myth you're living? And I would often ask my clients, not only what is the myth you're living, but where are you in that mythic cycle? And again, what they reported back would give me some clues. It occurred to me that if stories were so important to understanding ourselves and our own personal healing, then story could also be really important in coming to terms with social, cultural, group healing as well too. And so in starting this book on African mythology, I went to my friends in academia and I said to, probably a dozen of them, what were the myths that African societies told in order to help them heal from slaves being ripped from their midst? You can't just have a society where all of a sudden overnight you lose your mother, your father, your wife, your daughter, your son, your cousin, your uncle, and not have that impact you in some really deep and really meaningful way. And I figured, we couldn't go back and interview anyone because these events had happened in the 15th and 16th century, beginning then. But there must have been developed within these societies some deeper wisdom to help them manage the pain and the trauma. And if any place we could find those stories, it would be in the myths they told. Well, my friends kind of looked at me and scratched their head and said, that's a really great question. We don't know, we don't remember anybody ever asking that question, and we don't have an answer. We don't know. One night I was in the library at Western Washington University. Those are in the days, some of you I know out there remember, where you used to walk down the shelves of a library just because you loved books, and you'd read titles, and somehow you could almost sense what book you wanted to grab because the title appealed to you, or you had this kind of inner sense that you needed to, reach, grab one of these books. And so I was walking by and I saw a title. I didn't really know, other than a kind of an intuition, maybe I should grab the title. So I did grab it. It fell on the floor, literally. This is almost one of those kind of spooky myth stories. I picked up the book and I opened the page to the myth that described how African societies, a myth that described how African societies dealt with slaves being ripped from their midst. It was from the Bakongo of West Africa, and the entire Bakongo region what today is, the Congo and the Angola. That's where really the Portuguese captured and transported to the New World the earliest African slaves. And so it was a really significant find for me because, historically I understood that that's where slavery in the United States really began in Africa. What was so surprising to me was that that myth was not a myth or a story about victimization. Now, a lot of times, if we look at the African American past, what we identify both as scholars and as readers, as researchers, as people who have concern about the history of race and racism in this country, we look at the African American past with a story that's really couched in victimization. Slaves were robbed from Africa. Slaves were thrown on horrendous ships and transported across the Middle Passage, where perhaps as many as 20 million perished. Once slaves got to the New World, whether it was in the Spanish and Portuguese colonies to the south or the English colonies in North America, they were subjected to these horrible, horrible conditions. And even once slavery proper stopped, Jim Crow and slavery almost in an unobvious way continued, even down to this day, where we only need look, for example, at what's going on both with COVID-19 and the pandemic we're in and the unequal racial disparity in terms of how and what communities that disease affects, and even to the point of who gets the vaccine and who doesn't. So it would be all those things are true. They all happened. I mean, slavery happened that way. It was brutal. The Middle Passage was brutal. Those folks, so many millions of people died. The slave system was brutal. All of that is true. And yet what this myth from the Bakongo did that was so important to me is that instead of couching this story, and mind you, these folks from Bakongo didn't have an internet. They couldn't take a ship over and then come back and kind of report on what happened. They described the experience of slaves being ripped from their midst in the following way. They said that these men and women, and these are their words, not mine, were heroes or heroines thrust on a journey, not of their own choosing, who went across the water to a big island. That's how they conceived what was North America. And there they would suffer many, many years of trials and tribulations. Ultimately, they would gain wisdom. And eventually, they would return back to where they were taken with the wisdom that they had gained. Wow, that is the mythic cycle. Departure, a threshold of tremendous proportions, in this case, the Atlantic Ocean and the slave voyage, the voyage on a slave ship. Time facing trials and unbelievable tribulations, and yet somehow persevering, winning gifts or boons, and then returning to the point of origin. When I read that, suddenly my own sense of my history as an African American shifted in a way that reminded me of how the stories of those women I often worked with in a clinic shifted from one of being a victim to one of empowerment. That was what was so significant for me about really understanding not just mythology in general, but African mythology in particular, specifically these stories about slavery and the slave trade, and turning them in a sense on their head, not only looking at them as stories of victims, but really elevating the entire mythic cycle in terms of the African American experience to one of empowerment. based on that, I realized I have a story to tell. And that story then is about how mythology in general, but more specifically, African mythology, can be this marvelous healing force individually, but also collectively as well too, because we as African Americans have a choice in terms of how we view our history and how we understand ourselves in that history. Now, by viewing our history as one of empowerment as opposed to victimization, that doesn't mean that the victimization wasn't there. The trials and tribulations were there. And that certainly doesn't mean you don't actively work right now to right what might be injustices. But it is a very different sensibility that one comes to the struggle, if you will, with when you can stand on the truth of your own personal and social history from the truth in terms of empowerment, as opposed to that truth when couched in terms of victimization. It was really then kind of the key that unlocked the gift of African mythology for me and allowed me then to delve into not just the stories, but more importantly, the deeper wisdom contained in those stories. In writing the book, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't just redoing the kinds of books that I had seen and read on African mythology time and time again. You know, how did the leopard get its spots? I mean, those are great folk tales. And yes, all folk tales have within them a deeper kernel of wisdom. But I believed, and I didn't really know this to be true, but I believed that if Campbell was right, in other words, if all of the great traditions had within them this deeper kernel of wisdom, then the African traditions must have that deeper kernel as well. And I think I would even go one step further now, having done this work and this research, to say that is within the African traditions that you even find some of the kernels that later sprout into the flowering of mythology in the other traditions that many of us are so much more familiar with. And so I think before I open myself up to questions from my esteemed panelists and friends, I'll just tell a little story about what it was like to do the research for this book. Because I didn't want it just to be an academic book, although I spent a lot of time in libraries like the Rare Books collection of the University of British Columbia Library and the Rare Book collection at the Seattle University of Washington's library, my home library, Western Washington University. I also wanted to visit Africa and to see some of these sites as well. And so there is in particular in Southern Africa, a really ancient old people called the San, who have been masters of cave paintings for years. And we're talking now paintings that are way older than those at La Salle, which are probably, 17,000 years ago. The cave paintings in Africa are 20,000, 30,000, 40,000. When the radiocarbon dating was done on some of the colors there and the paints there, they found dates up to 60,000 years ago. So these really are some of the oldest paintings, the oldest representations of humanity that we can find. So I was actually, I was visiting my sister who taught at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. And I went to the La Palala Wilderness because I had heard there were some cave paintings that one could go there. And this was really my Indiana Jones kind of experience. So you can imagine me in one of an open lorry. I was in an open lorry on a wooden seat. And I have to tell you, I'd actually had some intestinal problems the day before. So I wasn't really happy to be bumping up and down on this seat, but there I was. And we were kind of tearing through the bush, There was no roads. And our driver's name was Jim. And I asked Jim about black mambas. And black mambas are some of the worst venomous snakes in the world. And just the week before, a friend of ours had actually had his father was killed because when he opened the door, what he thought was somebody knocking, it was actually a black mamba chasing a gecko up the front door. He opened the door and there was a black mamba staring him in the face, and it bit him, and you don't last very long. So I asked Jim, you know, basically like Indiana Jones, I don't like snakes. Okay, I asked Jim what was the deal with black mambas, and Jim's answer was, don't worry, they don't go too fast. And a moment later, we saw this snake kind of curling in and out of an anthill. So we got through this really tall grass. We got to the edge of a real jungle. And I mean, this is the kind of jungle, when you think about jungles with vines growing and all that other stuff, this was that kind of a jungle. And Jim said, well, we have to walk about a half a mile. So we walked through this jungle about a half a mile, and there were carpets of insects. And at a certain point in time, you know, you don't want to breathe, but if you do inhale, you're concerned that you will inhale a bug or something. And so we're kind of making our way through this carpet of insects in this jungle. And then we get to this cliff, and there's a goat with kind of a mountain goat with path on this cliff and a several 100-foot drop. And Jim says, well, we have to take that path, that kind of cliff path there. I also don't like heights, but I said, hey, you know, I want to do this. It's really worth it. I want to see these places that I'm writing about. And so we go on this cliff, and I'm kind of making my way with some trepidation, and we get to this alcove, and there, preserved in this alcove, is a painting. Now, this wasn't one of the 60,000-year-old paintings. There's only 12,000-year-olds, but what was so beautiful, and what the point of this story is, first of all, that Jim didn't know anything of what the painting was about. He was probably listening as closely to me as anything, so that the next people on his trips would get the real deal story. But there in this painting are these images that at first anthropologists used to say, gee, those African folks don't know how to draw animals even, because they draw animals that look like they're humans with animal heads. And what is all that about? Well, we know, and I've written about this, that those paintings were actually showing the inner experience of the San people going into a trance-like state. And in that state, the deep reverence and communication they had with their sense of the divine. And that sense was illustrated in these paintings by lines of force hitting at the base of the spine. And the San talked about a boiling energy that emerged from the base of their spine, traveled up their spine, and when it got to their head, flowered into this experience of light, which put them in touch with God. And I don't think it's hard at all to realize that that is a very similar description of the Kundalini experience. And I say this simply to say that within the deep wisdom and the sacred wisdom of Africa are the kernels of experience that we find in traditions around the world. Their significance was never lost on those who created these traditions, and the importance of these traditions as expressed in myth is not only their deep spiritual connection to their own sense of divinity, but how even today those stories can influence one's own experience of oneself, as it has for me, and a sense of what's possible in terms of healing in the world as well too. So I want to thank you for this opportunity to just say a few words of introduction. And I really do now look forward to engaging my friends and panelists, fellow panelists, in a discussion that might reflect and have us talk in more depth about some of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Clyde. It's just incredible to hear the way that your own personal experience blended with pilgrimage and journey, and to touch base with old myths that relate to your contemporary situation, our culture situation. It's just kind of about as ultimate of an example as it gets to see it all fit together like that, personal, cultural, collective myth. So thank you very much. And with that, I mostly want to defer to our panel, and I look forward to a rich conversation. As everyone knows, and it's a thick panel tonight, when you turn off your mute, we'll kind of know that you're ready to jump in. But since I know you have a couple friends in Connie and Dara, and we haven't had Dara here for a while, I thought I'd see if Dara wanted to open with a question.
I am so thrilled to be here and be with you, Clyde, in this wonderful panel. This is such important discussion that we are having because it goes so far past the visible world into something so vitally important to all of us. And I know when I was when I was at Pacifica and really being introduced to a lot of mythology, the thrill of, oh my God, and there I am, and you keep encountering it, and it really is thrilling. And because my work has to do with the creative side of everything, and working with narrative and story, and working with writers, I increasingly was excited about its application to the stories in which we live, and how this amplifies it. So just a quick little background. I got it in me one day because your book was fortunately one of the texts we read in school, and I said to myself, oh, wouldn't it be thrilling to do a seminar on story with Clyde? And out of the blue, I called you, and you were so gracious and wonderful. And so we actually taught at the Black Writers Group at the Writers Guild of America, and it was, to this day, when I think of all the courses I've taught, this it still remains so close to my heart, and one of my very favorite. What a thrill it was to work with you, and because it's so inspiring, it's so inspiring to be able to, as I said, oh my God, and there I am, to then see how much of the story that we live is in you, and you're able to communicate it in a way that you didn't realize the possibilities before you came in contact with these great mythic stories. So I have a question, and I'm going to let you take it anywhere you want to take it. But with my background with mythology and obviously storytelling, very often I will see a movie or read a book and become very frustrated that there was an instinct and something intuitive that pulled the storytellers, the movie makers, into the story. But because of the limitations of what they really didn't realize what they had. and so the story only opened, it was like something that wanted to blossom and never went any further. And I'm just curious if, as you encounter modern storytelling, if there are any films or anything in recent culture that you thought, I wish I could have had a talk with them because they didn't really understand the story that they had. I don't know. But you can take this any direction that it feels comfortable to you. But is there anything that spoke to you in that way, or opposite, that you did, that how they got a hold of that story and you're thrilled about that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks, Dara. And I remember that seminar with great affection. And one of the reasons I remember that seminar so well really is an answer to your question. And that is, do you remember the film that we focused on in that seminar?
I sure do.
It was Malcolm X by Spike Lee. And the reason we focused on that is you and I had spoken about that before, much along the lines of this question. And we liked the fact that we could trace almost all the elements of story in that film. And
Yes.
so I would say that, and you remember we did that, and the writers, they were like, oh my God, I didn't even realize that. And every aspect of how you might describe the typical hero, heroine cycle was in that film. So that's one film that I would say, yeah, that's really great, because you can see, and I doubt, I mean, I really doubt that Spike Lee sat down with Campbell's book, certainly not with mine, and said, let me include every element of that. Like you, Dana, you know, Dara, rather, I tell people all the time, look, myth is in your DNA. Even when you don't know it, you're going to tell a story in a mythic way, because story is so deeply a part of who you are. So I think good storytellers do that. You know, I can't off the top of my head pull down one movie that says to me that I want to gnash my teeth at, but I can tell you there's a lot of times that I am gnashing my teeth when I'm watching a movie, because like you, Dara, you know, I can't just watch it and just kind of let it wash over me. I'm kind of seeing what the writers are doing, and I'm saying, my God, you almost had a tiger by the tail, and yet you didn't really go through with that. And I think often in those cases of the mythic cycle where the hero or the heroine is given the opportunity for a journey and refuses it. And I do think that there is, to some extent, both within the industry, but also within all writers, there is a little bit of a block or a bridge that you have to cross within yourself to get to the other side, to feel open enough and to allow that creativity to pour through you without censoring yourself and truncating how you tell the story, because you think that's how people want to hear it.
I agree with you. And I am not suggesting, by the way, that we should be telling a mythic story directly.
Right.
I'm just saying that through the creative process, things, as you just said, you know, it just opens naturally. And my bias is that there should be a mythologist on staff at every studio in town, because they very often don't know what they have. And we're now, you know, there's a mythology that really is growing and blossoming through a lot of these comic book stories that are being told, and some of them are very good. I mean, they're very powerful, but again, they only go so far because they don't really understand what they have. And I'm thinking in particular of like Wonder Woman and Black Panther, and there is just more to this story, and if you knew it, it would like blast you forward, you know.
Yeah, and so Dara, that's a really, as you mentioned it, I'm reminded of gnashing my teeth when I was watching Black Panther and saying, oh my God, they almost got that. You know, why
Yes.
didn't I wish, and of course, I wish somebody had consulted me, because that was almost the you know, kind of the mythic cycle there, but not quite. Yeah, you know, but I think the other thing going on there, Dara, is also that unless the individual who's writing or individuals writing that have also released that within themselves, they won't get there in the writing. That is like a quintessential thing. So not only should they have mythologists on staff, but you know, they should probably have Jungian analysts on staff as well too, to help their writers really come to terms with what the personal issues are inside of themselves. Look, after I wrote Hero with an African Face, a fellow came up to me in the co-op here in Bellingham and said, why aren't you writing novels? He said, you know how to tell stories. You know how stories have been told for the last, you know, millennia. So why aren't you telling them? And I realized, oh my God, he was right. And so I started writing novels. But I was so glad that I had written that book on African mythology first, because it had helped release something inside of me, which helped me understand how you tell a good story. And a lot of times, you know, we always say this in script writing, right? You don't tell the story, you don't write on the nose. You don't tell, you don't want to do that, but you do want to convey a sense of this deeper journey that all human beings go on. But if you haven't gone on that journey yourself, it's not easy to do, if it's even possible.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Well, we have to connect you with makers of Black Panther. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate that.
Anyone else on the panel?
Yes, I'd like to jump in here, Clyde. I have two questions. One's a safe question, and the other one makes me uncomfortable.
Great.
So I'm going to choose the uncomfortable question.
Thank you.
And I love the story of your writing about it and then going to the soil, going to Africa. So I haven't really sketched this out, but let me just get out on the table. What might I, as a white male, traveling to Africa, gain from that? I'm purposely being a little naive because I want to be open-ended here. Would it point out to me necessarily where I'm limited? Might I see or experience something of my own traumatic history that could take me as deeply into that experience as you have experienced traveling there and seeing the caves and seeing the cave paintings? And conversely, Clyde, might you read Homer's Odyssey and gain something from that traumatized warrior seeking home that I never saw?
Sure.
So that's where I am in the experience of it as a white male that is, biologically true, but am I psychologically, by the very fact of my biology, limited in what I could experience there in Africa, with real depth?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's where I am.
Boy, Dennis, first of all, thank you for that question. It is a very, I think, heartfelt question. It certainly has a lot of depth, not only to the question, but there's so many ways to look at possibly finding answers to that. So let me start by saying this, and this is going to seem a little bit roundabout, but I hope I can pull it together. As I listened to you talk, and specifically talking about, could I get something from Homer and could you get something from Africa? The first thing I thought of was the German philosopher, ethnographer, anthropologist, Adolf Bastian. And Bastian described two kinds of fundamental streams, right, in mythic or philosophical thinking. What he described as elementary Gedanken,
Right,
which is the universal themes, the elementary ideas, and the Volksgedanken. Gedanken is the German word for thinking or thought or idea, and that is the local expression of these elementary ideas. So at an elementary level, obviously, there are things that I could take from Homer, particularly having understood African mythology in this way, and Homer's struggles. And from an elementary idea point of view, there are obvious things that you, as a white male, could take from African mythology. But I also think there's something really important to understand at the folk level, at the local inflection, at the experiential level in that area as well too. And so here is what I would say. If I was going to be your travel agent, I would say to you, Dennis, if you're going to go to Africa, the first places you should go to are the West African slave castles in Ghana and Senegal. I've been there. I was there years and years ago. I was there before I went to South Africa and the paintings there. And I had the experience back before they were as manicured as they are now of just finding the guy in town, the local kind of guide. And this was a man whose back was stooped to the shape and the arch of the damp, dark hallway. It wasn't even really a hallway. It was an earthen kind of tunnel that led from the outside all the way down to the male slave quarters. And he carried, literally, it was like out of a myth. He carried a creaking oil lamp, and he basically, with his crooked finger, said, "Hey, come follow me." And I did. I was 16 years old at the time. I just graduated from high school on my way to college, and somehow, I don't know, it was whatever speaks to us in terms of where we need to go. Something told me that summer I needed to go to Africa. I went to Ghana. I went to the slave castles on the coast, and I had this. So I went down in this slave castle, and you walk all the way down, and all the way down, you're under the sea. And on the way down, this old fellow stopped, pointed to a door, and he said, "Do you know what that door is?" And of course I did, because I'd done a little bit of reading, and that was the door of no return, where they literally basically kicked slaves out into the Atlantic Ocean who were either too sick or too unruly, or they didn't have enough space for. And we got down, down, down. Again, we're under the sea at this point. And I'm walking around, and at first it feels like you're walking on leaves. And you hear all this bizarre crunching under your foot, and I'm wondering what's going on here. And I stoop down, it's all dark, you can't see. And I realized, oh my God, I'm walking on the rusted remains of slave chains. And I remember that old man said to me, "Your ancestors came through here." And the moment he said that, all of a sudden, I had an out-of-body trance-like experience, and my head started spinning, and I started to hear voices. And the voices I heard were saying almost in unison the same thing. And what they were saying was, "Whatever you do in life, my son, make it count for us." Now, the only other time I have had a similar experience, and it was very similar, was about 20 years after that experience at the slave castles. I was in Munich, Germany, and I decided to walk to Dachau. It just felt to me like, why take a tour bus? That wasn't the way those many Jews who went into that concentration camp and never came out. They were crowded into train cars and walked there. So it just felt like a pilgrimage in that way. And when I got to Dachau in front of the gas chambers, I had exactly the same experience of hearing voices. And in that respect, I think there's probably something really valuable for you, for anyone who could experience and is sensitive to that level of humanity and brutality, could experience going to the slave castles.
Yeah.
But then I want to go one step further, Dennis, and I want to say the myths itself also speak in a way that I take and should take something very different from what you might take from the same African myth. So let's go to the myth of the Bakongo. And that was the myth I discovered, really, that had to deal with slavery and what happened when slaves were ripped from the midst of these societies.
Yeah.
So the Bakongo have a tripart division of the world in which the top, or the sky essentially, is the realm of the ordinary world. And then there's this dividing line, which was the horizon of the Atlantic Ocean. And then beneath that is a world of the dead called Imputu. Now, the Portuguese word the Bakongo word, or the Kikongo, that's the language, the Kikongo word for the Portuguese is Mputulezo. And the reason it is connected to this is that in the myths, the Europeans who raided for slaves were viewed as the witches and the wizards of the underworld to which the slaves were then subjected to in their transformation over the horizon into this land that the Bakongo actually called Mputu. Now, Mputu is also the land that all Bakongo souls go to in their cycle of death and resurrection. And Mputu is also the land in which the heroes journey to fight these fabulous forces and then, struggle out. So in some respects, Dennis, the transition over the Atlantic to Mputu is very much like the ferrymen over the river Styx. And the importance there in a psychological terms is that now you are talking about the process of going from this deep layer under the water, which is one's unconscious, to the ordinary world, which is one's conscious life, or vice versa, from the conscious to the unconscious. And what I see there is the opportunity to talk about and perhaps to work with as an individual, what are the unconscious forces in my life that lead to things like, unintended bias, unconscious racism? How do I bring those out? What is the process by which I then can, and I'm talking here really saying I, meaning you, how can I be my own ferryman on the river Styx or boatman on the Atlantic and bring forth those to the light of consciousness in a way that they might change? Now, I know there's a lot of folks who are actually actively, and most of them are white folks who are actively working on anti-racist ideas and anti-bias ideas. I think that's one of the difference in terms of, we could say, the movement now as opposed to the movement, when I grew up in it back in the 60s. And I think that's great. And I think that is supported in the myth.
Yeah.
Now, again, in that same myth, there's a different piece that I'm taking from it.
Right.
I'm taking from it the hero or the heroine who journeys through into Mputu and out again. But there is that other element there. And so, as all great myths do, and I know I don't have to tell you this, all great myths speak to whomever is reading or listening to that myth in a way that's appropriate to what it is they need to take from that myth. As we say in terms, the road rises to meet the traveler. The adventure you get, the story you get is the one that you need and that you're most prepared to receive.
Yeah. Clyde, that response was so helpful. I hope, and not just to me, I'm sure to everybody listening. So thank you for that. There was a wonderful set of analogies that you put out there between cultures. So I'm very grateful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Clyde, thank you so very much. It was, you just opened me up into another dimension here about looking at this, and I'm kind of blown away. Where I got locked into was the cave paintings, the shamanically divine cave paintings, and how that was missed for so long. And I'm wondering, as a white woman, where the divinity is here in our culture now, and what am I missing?
Mm. Mm. Yeah, isn't that's a wonderful question. Thank you so much. Wow. I would say that it's not only you as a white woman, but many of us who miss the divinity that, or struggle to find the divinity here in this culture. For me, as an African-American, I would also have to say that it's hard to find that divinity when the culture delivers it in such literal terms, in terms of literal interpretations of the big three religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, and not in the deeper spiritual truths. So what the African myths always remind me of, and that cave painting really reminded me of, as you know, my good friend Connie knows, I grew up in more of a Hindu tradition. And so when you start to talk about Kundalini, I get that. But to see that the common experience of humanity even 60,000 years ago was the same, that reminds me to always look beneath the surface, even of the literal presentations of religion that were given. So, for example, I remember in writing the book, there's a section of the book on the African cross. And this is a symbol that is in African cosmological systems thousands, if not hundreds of thousands years before you see it appear in the West. And I was going to a concert, and I think I even described this in the book. My good friend Tony Brown, who's a world-renowned African-American baritone singer, and he was singing a set of traditional African-American spirituals, many of which came from slave traditions. And he was doing it in one of the large churches, Christian churches in Seattle. And so there's a huge cross on the wall. And I remember often if I would go to a church like that, I'd have a real problem, with the cross, because somehow what it represented in the West didn't speak to me. But now, having understood more of how that cross symbolized for African mythology, the sacralization of the earth wherever it was drawn, and how it represented divinity manifesting into humanity and humanity merging back into divinity, I sat there and I marveled. I just sat there kind of in rapture with Tony singing, and I love Tony's voice, but the opportunity given to me then to look beyond the veil of how religion is traditionally presented to this deeper truth that we know to be there. And it really was mythology that helped me, and in particular African mythology, find those deeper truths. So I think I would say really an answer to your question is we can start where we are right now, even with the, if and I'm speaking in a more general sense, because I know many in this audience have a spiritual tradition, maybe it's from the East that they are part of, but in a general sense, anyone who's interested can start wherever they are and just keep digging deeper and deeper and deeper. And if you dig deeper in any of the traditional, religious or spiritual traditions, you get to common ground. And once you're at common ground, then this kind of miraculous world opens up. That's why I wrote the book. That's what I didn't like about Campbell. Campbell chose not to dig for common ground in Africa. Again, I was glad he didn't, because I could. But that's what I would say really is start wherever you are and just keep digging. Or as the Buddhists say, before enlightenment, dig, dig, dig. This is my take on it. After enlightenment, dig, 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 and just keep digging until you find that common ground. And I must say, and this is just comes to me as I'm talking, there is a wonderful book by the African-American scholar Howard Thurman, who was Martin Luther King Jr.'s teacher. And this really is a good answer also to your question. It was Howard Thurman who in the 30s met with Mahatma Gandhi. It was Howard Thurman who inspired Benjamin Mays that Benjamin should come to meet with Mahatma Gandhi. It was Howard Thurman who actually then brought the ideas from Gandhi back to King. And actually it was Gandhi who had gotten the ideas about nonviolence previously from George Washington Carver. There's this marvelous history in the African-American experience of this intersection, this play back and forth between Eastern spirituality and the manifestations of spirituality on the front lines of social justice. But Howard Thurman's book was called The Search for Common Ground. And it was all about how even within traditions like Christianity, you can get to a level of these deeper truths that not only help you in your daily life, but help you struggle in terms of bringing about a more just, equitable world. And really, it's a beautiful tradition to be able to connect King in this way to some of the teachings and the mythologies that many of us know, but don't realize the deep and the fundamental connection there.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much.
You're welcome.
So Clyde, you made a connection for me with the original story that you told, that was not about victimhood, but was about the hero's journey.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you can relate that to the whole movement in the West for racial equity.
Sure.
You know, I think when I was in Berkeley in the late 60s, I joined the Black Panthers. And I think part of my attraction was that people were not victims. The empowerment attracted me. And I think it's what repelled a lot of white people and scared a lot of white people. And this whole arc from then until now with BLM, how do you see that mythologically, or do you? Is there a story arc there that you can describe?
Sure. You know, again, Connie, that's a great question. And I do think in mythic terms, when I look at the history of the Black freedom struggle from the Panthers, and, you know, I was one of the Panthers armed in those days, and to now with BLM. And I think what I would add to what you said about empowerment is there are two different levels of empowerment, or at least two levels of empowerment. One is an external level of empowerment in which you look powerful. And the other is an internal level of empowerment in which you know yourself to be empowered because you've penetrated a veil in which you understand some deeper, more fundamental truths about who you are. Now, I would absolutely agree with you that in the 60s, organizations like the Panthers had that level and degree of external empowerment. And I think that attracted many of us, certainly attracted me more to, you know, kind of the radical end of Black Power movement than it did to more traditional aspects like King. But I know, because I knew many of those people really well, that the empowerment was also a reaction to victimization. And that was what some of us, and it's just a handful of us. I can think, for example, of my mentor, Vincent Harding, a couple of other people whose names I can't think of right now, at a point, probably in the late 60s, said, wait a minute, we're asking people to change, and yet within ourselves, we don't even know what that change looks like. That was a really powerful moment when people started to pull back from just pushing out and saying things have to change in the society, and they do. There's no question about that. No argument there. But also understanding that there was a fundamental level of looking within that also needed to take place. And so my mentor, Vincent Harding, and I mentioned Vincent because Vincent was also Martin Luther King Jr.'s speechwriter. So many of the words that King spoke so eloquently, Vincent wrote. King's most famous speech, probably at least the one that many of us resonate to, is the Beyond Vietnam speech, April 7th, or April 4th, 1967. Every word of that speech was actually written by my dear friend, teacher, and mentor when he was alive, Vincent Harding. And so Vincent really helped me in particular, understand that if we were going to go forward, we had to go in first. And Vincent actually undertook the practice of Vipassana Buddhism as a form of going in to help stabilize him, and I'm just using that word, in all of the efforts that he was doing outside as well too. That was a really critical moment for me in understanding how and why the external empowerment also needed to be supported by an internal empowerment. And Connie, you know a little bit of my history. it was at that point that I got deeply involved with the Satchidananda Ashram, and also my own, Hindu path, which eventually led to a Buddhist practice. But it was really from that understanding that people like Vincent had transmitted to me, of recognizing that there was something important first about going in before you attempted to move out. Now, I'll also say that even in the more traditional wing of the Black freedom struggle in the 60s, that aspect was still there. And by that, I mean, before young people were sent out to face water cannons or to do sit-ins or protest of any nature, there was always a moment of spiritual training that they went through. Now, much of that was couched in terms of the Black church. And there's a really good reason for that. And the reason might not be one that's obvious. The reason actually goes back to Howard Thurman and Gandhi. When Howard Thurman and Gandhi met in the 30s, Howard was asking Gandhi how he went about challenging the power. And Gandhi basically said, look, I used my ashrams as places to inculcate in the individuals who would face the might of the British Empire, a spiritual center that would allow them to be solid as they faced the injustice and fought for it. And Howard Thurman said to Gandhi, well, in America, African Americans don't have ashrams, but we sure as hell have a network of churches, and those can be our ashrams. Now, again, very few people know that history. I think it's beautiful because what it shows is how it was a spiritual or mythic wisdom that went into first inculcating the young people who went out to battle. Now, something similar to that happened, for example, this is one thing I often think about, in the 1940s when the Navajos sent their young men to join the army. What was the first thing they did? They had those young men undergo a spiritual initiation that involved a mythic cycle, and that's where the whole journey of the two twins to find their father comes from. And so the reason that I mention that is I hope, I don't know for sure, but I hope that our young people who are out in the front lines today also recognize and value and realize the importance of having this mythic spiritual center that in no way detracts from the need to bring about social change, in fact, allows you to do it even better. That, to me, is the mythic story that knits together a long history of struggle within the African American tradition, and one that I, again, really hope survived. Not just the external empowerment and struggle, it's relatively easy to do that. It's a little harder to do this when that means you have to look within first, even if you're going to be incredibly active and demanding of social justice and racial equity outside.
So beautiful.
Thanks for asking the question, Connie.
Hello. I really enjoyed the presentation, and I've been thinking that perhaps when I look at the chapters of the Quran that are named after olives and figs and cows and times of days, afternoons, and all that, it seems like what you were describing in those cave paintings is probably another example of how much we have disconnected ourselves from nature. And whether that nature is the animal kingdom, if you can call it that. I don't know if you can use a republic for it instead, or that for plants and vegetations and all that. But we have kind of in the name of development and progress and the dominance of technology and the independence and all that, we have become way too distant from nature. And so what might have been in those cave paintings where there were human beings with the heads of the say different animals, we probably see some semblance of that in the our sports teams, where we have the Vikings, we have all these other. I don't know whether this was done consciously or they just happen. But other than that, we are a little too distant from it. But I also wanted to ask in a more direct way the question as to the underworld.
Yes.
That we have the version of it that you explained in the Congo. And then, of course, we have the Egyptian version, which somehow jumps the Mediterranean and becomes part of the Greek. And then, of course, in almost every culture, we have the underworld. My question here is whether there is a whole lot of universality in that, or is there some way an originality of that underworld that probably comes from Africa, and during the long course of history we have forgotten the origin, that yes, there was an underworld there that has become part of our common culture in almost every color and shade.
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, thank you so much for that. And I also can't help at least saying a little bit about what your first observations are about the separation between man and nature. There are a couple of African myths which really speak to that. One of the myths that I love that is the myth of Unambote, and of course it's Unambote who's sitting in, and again, I got to say this myth is way before Christianity ever got to Africa, but Unambote is sitting in a garden, and and God comes down and tells Unambote there's a particular fruit on this tree, but don't eat it. If you do eat it, you're going to be in big trouble. And then the snake comes into the garden. And if it sounds a little bit like the Garden of Eden story, it's certainly there. But again, what's most important is also, of course, Unambote eats the fruit, because that's the manifestation or the representation of humanity connecting with their fundamental affinity and deep connection to the natural world. Now, in the cave paintings, the interesting piece is that the early anthropologists would often just say, those Africans, they don't know how to draw the natural world, which was just really funny because they thought, well, and all sorts of explanations for why. One of the explanations by von Daniken, for example, was that aliens actually drew these pictures, and these were aliens. Nobody would give Africans the benefit of understanding why the cave paintings were drawn with these heads of animals on bodies. So in the 1930s, an African guy, a fellow, a son, out of the blue, his name, I don't know how to pronounce it, Q-I-N-G is how it was spelled, walks into an office of anthropologists. And you can imagine these anthropologists are just probably, their eyes are blinking, their heads are rolling. And this guy walks in and says, hey, I'm going to tell you exactly what San mythology was all about. And so they're furiously scribbling away. And I think he spent about 2 weeks, and then he disappears. Nobody ever hears from him again, but he delivered probably the greatest insights about San mythology. So to make a long story short, and it really speaks to your point about joining with the African world, Africans in the San drew those heads on human figures because they understood their deep and abiding connection. Most of those figures were antelopes, and they drew them on the antelopes because those antelopes were the animal that they hunted. But just as with the buffalo and the Native American traditions, not only was the food animal food for their physical bodies, it was food for their soul and their spiritual bodies. And there was a very direct process by which they hunted, watched the antelope pass into the next world, and saw themselves also passing into that realm as they were part of the hunt, even to the point that the spiritual dance they did, which was all about raising this Kundalini-like energy, was them mimicking the dance of the antelopes as the antelopes died. And in fact, the process by which the San people then connected with this deeper sense of divinity and spirituality was even called a death. So there is this fundamental, just kind of really very, very deep connection then between the San, between the myth, between the actual rituals which are enacting the myth, both in terms of dance and also in the killing of the animals as well too. Now, the problem I'm having is that in answering all of that, I have forgotten your question. So would you just briefly tell me again what your question was? And I'd like to pick up on it because I thought I might have had something that I could say there as well too.
Oh, that's a good way of linking to I got sidetracked to this, the killing of the animals, which probably was the initial sacrifice, which then get into human sacrifice and all that. But my question was the element of the universality that we see. Is the universality primal or is the originality of the underworld? Which one is the case? I mean, we all come from Africa, and kind of, I mean, it's a given that the originality would be from there, but somehow we have forgotten that. And when you look at the universality of it in the mind of most of us, and I put that us in quotation marks, in the minds of most of us, the African element is marginalized. And so we are looking at it as more, the farthest we'll go would be a kind of a Middle Eastern mythology, but not farther beyond that.
Yeah, again, a great question. And here's how I'd answer it, kind of in a way that I spoke of before, but this has always been the question in comparative mythology, right? Are these mythologies similar because there's a fundamental commonality between human beings, or is there just some synchronicity in which a mythology pops up here and a mythology pops up there, and they're locally popping up mythologies, but maybe they have some similarities there. So this is a question that I think, mythologists and anthropologists and cultural ethnographers have struggled with, or at least wrestled with for years. I think that in a sense, you can follow and see both themes. Again, like Bastian, like Jung, there is this sense of the elementary ideas or a collective unconsciousness that manifests itself in local expressions in a particular way. However, you are completely right when you say that we have not really connected the African origins of that stream of unconscious truths, of mythic truths. And I'll just give you one really good example. I was in the rare books collection at the University of British Columbia, and I came across the writings in the middle 1800s of an anthropologist whose name I do not remember, but wrote about a culture on would be the east coast of Africa, who way back, he traced this back some several thousand years, had a figure that reminded him of the work he had done in India with the god Shiva. And he had done, and I believe the figure's name was something like Suni Goab. And I just was fascinated in reading this, didn't see how I could really fit it into the book, but realized there was a wealth of material there about how the diffusion of these ideas may have even happened out of Africa. This anthropologist was saying way before it was popular that it probably happened from people actually traveling the coast of Africa into India. And we now know that that is a route of cultural diffusion that took place. Closer to home, and even including the Egyptian mythologies, I've always been of the belief, and I think we could really do that tracing. It's probably a great PhD thesis in there for somebody who looks at the diffusion of African mythic traditions into Egypt, into Upper Egypt, lower not the southern portion of the Nile, and looks at how those deeper traditions actually then became the basis of many of the Egyptian mythologies that ultimately crossed over into the Middle East and eventually also became part of all of the Middle Eastern mythologies that gave rise to the Middle Eastern religions, the big three, the Abrahamic religions of Christianity, Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, and Catholicism. So I do think that diffusion is there if we look for it. And I also believe that particularly as time goes on, you see local expressions overtop this fundamental stream of mythic wisdom that then develop it further into a particular aspect that's identifiable with a particular culture. Thank you.
And thank you. I think there is also that connection, like what you can see in Hathor in Egypt, and then the calf, and then you see the first chapter of the Quran named the cow, and then you go over to India. I think the theme runs through most of these cultures. We may have to do more research to connect them, I guess. But thank you very much.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. As I said, I think that somebody's got a wonderful PhD thesis and a life's work just looking at those connections. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation and for your book. When I first saw your book at a bookstore, it allowed me to believe that I could think otherwise, and that there were people out there who thought the way I thought, so I very much appreciate it. I have a question, and then after that, I want to push back a little bit on your notion of choice. My question is, part of the description of your talk was how we could use myth to talk about race.
Mm-hmm.
Could you elaborate a little bit on that? I mean, given what happened April 5th or 6th and the kind of insurrection, and the inability, our ability to talk across, around, and underneath race, you may be onto something that's very, very important. So could you talk a little bit about, again, how myth allows us to talk about race?
Sure. First of all, thanks for that question. And, you know, if I was going to look back at January 6th in the US Capitol, and if I was going to also look back at, you know, everything that happened over the summer, you know, certainly going back to George Floyd's death and way beyond that. And I want to tell you also, Vorris, as thinking even about George Floyd's death, and I'm finishing a book, should come out next year from HarperCollins, I was able to trace back the image of a person in power and authority putting their knee on the neck of someone they were subjugating way back into the mythic traditions of early Christianity. And so there is, again, you know what they always say about myth? Myth is the tune you dance to even when you don't know it's playing. And so I do think that there is within Western culture these deeper themes about power and domination that have mythic origins that get played out in ways that the folks playing them out don't even understand that they are playing out those tunes. And that I think is really important, first as a basis of understanding. Now, beyond that, those of us who are advocating for change, who are fighting for change, who are out on the streets working for change, the role that mythology can play there, which is really fundamentally important, is what I said earlier. We don't need to feel that we are advocating on the behalf of victims. Yes, I hate the fact that George Floyd was murdered by the Minneapolis Police Department. I hate the fact that Breonna Taylor was murdered by police who stormed into her house in her apartment and shot her. I reject that that is the way we should be living in a society. And yet, were I to look at those incidents from the point of view of the African societies, which originally their ancestors and our ancestors came from, they would say those are horrible things, but they are also not indications of victimization. They can be viewed in terms of empowerment as well too. That to me is really critical, because it means that I am not struggling against you and seeing myself as a victim. I am out there struggling for social justice and racial equity, seeing myself as an empowered individual, not just because I'm raising my fist, but because I understand inside myself, I have a center. I have a center that I'm not going to be knocked off of. You know, like that old gospel song says, you know, not going to let anybody turn me around. And having that place of not letting anybody turn me around is really important when everybody out there is trying to turn you around. Whether they're the folks storming the Capitol, whether they're the pundits on Fox News claiming that Black Lives Matter is equivalent to the folks storming the Capitol, you name it. Having a center that you're not going to get turned around on, I think is essential to really being deeply engaged in the everyday struggle and the challenges that take. And that center, for some people, not for everybody. I'll never say that there's a one size fit all here, but for me at least, and others, that center has been a mythic center. Just tell you one more story that directly comes from the book to show, I think, the power of this mythic center. I was totally amazed. But for the first 10 to 15 years after this book was published, I've got letters, and I still have them in my file cabinet, on a monthly basis from men in prison, many of them in on death row, thanking me for writing the book because it helped them come to terms with the circumstances of their lives. Wow. I mean, I really did not write the book thinking that at all. But what I realized then is that there is a way in which mythic wisdom helps you come to terms with the circumstances of your life, in which you no longer have to view yourself as a victim, but you can view yourselves in an empowered way. That is key. I think it's critical. I think that's probably one of the most important things that people of color in this society can do, and that is to find that center from which no one can turn you around. And that center is going to be a spiritual or mythic center, and that is incredibly important.
Thank you. And that doesn't make sense to me. I mean, after all, the African-American spiritual, Negro spiritual tradition has always been about both inside and outside.
Yes. Yes.
So I do understand that. And I understand how you are using, given your own politics. So I support that thoroughly. However, I do want to push back a little bit on the notion of choice.
Please.
First, let me say the fact that I support young the way that I do. Clearly, I think that individual transformation of the self is vitally important, and in many ways precedes politics. So I'm rolling with you there. But I think what the notion of choice, we have to understand that in the current culture, the notion of choice is seen as a very conservative, dominant notion that dominates not only economics, but politics. It's called neoliberalism. The notion that we all have choices. And we are where we are because we did not make the right choices, right? And I think we have to understand that when we use that term choice, that it doesn't particularly kind of work that is ultimately conservative. And what do I mean by that? It's the notion of language. In 2008, I think, Dennis wrote this wonderful piece on where he was advocating for what he called an aesthetic psychology. Mm-hmm. And if I'm quoting you, Dennis, please correct me. And in that piece, he was talking about, he reviewed James Hillman's book about City and Soul, I believe. And he brought up this very big this notion of Hillman and language. Mm-hmm. And let me read that to you. And this is why I'm pushing back against choice. Mm-hmm. What Dennis wrote is, language itself carries psychic health and illness. One might look with great effect to the health of language and its freedom from cliché expressions, worn-out phrases, conventional knee-jerk sentences, sound bites, unconscious use of metaphors to clean the soul illness of a people, of a city, of a civilization. Further, he writes, and this is only one other paragraph, right? It is one measure to learn, to observe. It is quite another to find fresh language free from group speak and the dead mudding of exhausted words that compromise what he refers to as the malady of psychic numbing.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have people who don't have a critical relationship to language, I have one because I was fortunate in terms of who I met, et cetera, et cetera. Language does us as well as we do language.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to take that into account when we talk about choice. We all don't have the same amount of choices. We all don't have the same kind of psychology that allows us to choose. And as demonstrated, I finish here, the improvement of the quality of life depends on a restoration of language, which notices the properties of bodies, the qualities of life. An African-American feminist, Hortense Phillips, put it another way. Indeed, sticks and stones may break our bones, but words would certainly kill us.
Sure.
So I'm not arguing against your notion of choice. What I'm arguing for is a more textured deployment of the word choice. We can take into account of the importance of language.
Sure.
After all, myth is conveyed through talk, plurality, and language. Most of our sessions, in terms of therapy, right, is a talking cure.
Sure.
So I'm a little concerned about that. Can you respond? Tell me what you think.
Absolutely. You know, I would go one step further and say choice is a privilege. And a lot of people don't have that privilege. But here's the piece. Once you experience your privilege to choose, I also think it might be incumbent upon you to be the teacher that helps others experience their privilege they may not even know they had to choose in that way as well. And I don't mean that you go around teaching everybody, oh, you got to understand myth. Look, I'll just cite an example from somebody you probably know, that's Kwame Scruggs, and the wonderful work that he's doing with young people. But that is helping them know they have a choice. And that is a certain privilege and freedom that if you proliferate well enough among communities of color, now you have more power in knowing that you didn't have before. So yes, I agree 100% with you. Language is important, choice is a privilege, but I do think some of us, and I have to say, my brother, you're one of those people. So I think it's your responsibility too, when you break through that point of realizing you do have choice, it's incumbent upon you to find a way to share that. How you made that breakthrough, what you did with that, how that helped you, how that empowered you, how that changed your life, how that fueled your capability to go out in the world and be more productive about bringing about the kind of changes. It's incumbent upon us to do that. I think that's the beauty of, knowing these mythic traditions. And I'd go right back to saying, knowing that myth can be that center, that axis mundi in each of us around which we are not going to be moved. We need to find ways to share that, particularly with the young people today who may not be getting that same teaching in church because they're not going there anymore, who may not be finding that same teaching in their own coming of age experiences, because unless they're part of Kwame Scruggs' organization, may not have that available to them. It's up to us to get out there and make that available on a more widespread basis. So thank you for pushing back with that question. I think it's an important question, and I'm sure we could go on a little bit more with that. But I'll also ask if there's anyone else who wants to answer a question, or ask a question. But thank you, Vorris. I really appreciate that.
I thank you. I like this serious engagement. Thank you.
And thanks for being here, Kwame. Hi, Kwame. Definitely important to evoke. We haven't heard from Jennifer yet, and she's a special guest with us tonight. Jennifer, I wonder if you had any words for us, and also, just want to point out we're getting amazing commentary in the chat. I hope everybody's following that as well, and we're going to try and bring in as much as we can. Incredibly rich evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Will. Dr. Ford, thank you so much for your work. I'm really moved by it. And I was thinking today about when you talk about moving from victimization to empowerment, I was thinking about how important that is for the white community as well.
Yes.
To move from not just being the victimizers, but to being empowered to make a difference as well. And I was thinking about, I've spent 20 years researching Dr. Martin Luther King, and he talks about the poison that lives inside of the white American psyche around race, and the importance of kind of purging that poison from ourselves. And so that connected to me with your line in your book, which is so beautiful, where you say that we want to wake our gods where we had thought only to wrestle our demons. And so I was thinking about for white people, for myself and for the white people that I work with, that it's important to not just see ourselves as demonizers, but the capacity for agency as well. Not to see ourselves as gods in any way, because that's where we got in trouble in the first place, but to kind of awaken our better angels around issues of race. And what I'm really moved by in your idea of there is this idea of, you talk about the hero's quest being this universal quest to go into our own, kind of personal, but also cultural and racial unconscious, to kind of confront what's there. And I think that's really important. And I've been really frustrated by, I think, white people of goodwill to not be willing to do that sort of confrontation, to go into their own unconscious and to confront the poison that lives inside of there, to sort of purge it. So I think your book is really beautiful in that sense. And you talk about Dr. King in your chapter on the myths of death and resurrection, where you say, this is a great line where you're talking about, you ask the question, what is the monster consuming my humanity? And it's so beautiful. And I think that was what King was pointing to, that the monster that's consuming the psyche, the humanity of white people is racism. And then you ask these questions, am I prepared to enter the belly of my beast, to wrest whatever victory is mine? What parts of myself am I willing to sacrifice in this life-challenging effort? Am I ready to face possible ridicule and scorn from those who would not understand my hero's quest? And so I just offer that to the white community as some questions for us to, sorry about my dog. She's just saying amen and aho to that. But I think your book has so much wisdom for us to think about as well as we confront our own racial unconscious. So thank you.
Thank you,
question,
Jennifer.
just a comment, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. And I'll just say, you did touch the point of the book that I was hoping you would bring up when I knew you were going to be on this program, and that is mentioning King. And that came from King in Birmingham, letter from Birmingham jail. And I know there's at least, I think it was Will, you were in Birmingham talking about your uncle who has a birthday there, and I really connected with that portion of the book there. Again, I think the important thing that also came from Jennifer was a myth. It came from the African myth, a Lesotho myth of Latualoni and Kamapa, where in that myth, Latualoni is the hero who has this miraculous birth and then swallowed by this monster and fights his way out. And of course, the appropriate psychological understanding of that is, what's the monster swallowing you? What do you have to use that you can dig deep within inside of you to help you fight your way out? What type of understanding that you have? So in that respect, in many ways, this goes back to the question that Dennis had earlier, is how a myth can have multiple meanings depending on what the nature of your struggle is. And here I really found what was interesting was that was also the myth. The very point of the book that you described, that was the point of the book, that those men who wrote to me and were on death row said, that's when I got it. That's made all the difference to me. And, I did not follow all of these men through, but I'm assuming that some of them were actually put to death. But somehow understanding that myth and the very questions you asked was important to them, and I think is important to us, whether we're African American, whether we're from a community of color, whether we're not, but also struggling with those issues. I mean, that's an area where mythology, I think, becomes essential. And actually in the book, I even talk in a later chapter about the rituals which would ask some of those questions to ourselves. And in my own way, and some of the work I've done with large groups of people, up to 1,000 people, have had them en masse do that ritual. And there is a ritual of the 4 directions in which each of those questions has an appropriate direction. Often it's with a cross drawn on the floor. And when you turn to each of those directions, much like a mandala that Jung might have used, there's an appropriate question you contemplate at that direction. And therefore you can use that as the entryway into exploring some of the deeper issues that you talked about, whether it's a community of the color, exploring some of the empowerment that I know can be there in a better way for them, or whether it's a white community looking at some of the issues of unconscious bias and racism that they all also need to bring forth. So again, to me, I'm partial, but I think mythology is a rich source of pointing a direction of both personal and social healing for that very reason.
Beautiful, thank you. Also, I was just going to ask you a quick question about, when you talk about doing the inner work and the importance of doing that, I'm so fascinated by that. And King has this term, I'm sure you know, he talks about the transformed nonconformist, which is really that combination of doing the inner work as we're doing the outer work, not doing the inner work first, but doing it in conjunction. Was that Vincent Harding's idea, or do you?
I don't know that it was Vincent directly, but I do know that idea of transforming the nonconformist was part of the dialogue that Vincent and you might remember. I can't remember the fellow's name who went up to teach at Harvard, who later became a Buddhist, who was very deeply involved with Stokely in the SNCC and the creation of the Black Power movement. I forget his name, it just slips me. But that was part of the sense of what it meant, that you couldn't just go about making change in the world until you had deeply transformed yourself in some way, looked at yourself in terms of change. I mean, we broke it down a little more simply in saying what we'd often say in not so eloquent as Vincent and wrote and Martin spoke. We would simply say, how can you ask people to change if you haven't changed yourself? Mm-hmm. And I think that's what, again, mythology was so important for me, is recognizing, wow, that is really true. How can you get in front of a group of people and say, y'all have to change, and you have to do this, and you have to do that, and we want you to do this, when within a lot of those pieces that you haven't come to terms with either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if anyone's interested who's on the call, just type in transform nonconformist and King, and you can read his speech on that. Yes. It's really beautiful.
And thank you for bringing that up, Jennifer.
Yeah.
Again, I think that was an important moment in the freedom struggle when people recognized how important that was. I will also say, if we're going to continue this conversation a little, that probably you could also find elements of that in the dialogue that Howard Thurman had with Mahatma Gandhi. And that is, I think, also an incredibly important moment to understand in the Black freedom struggle, because it was Howard looking for the spiritual inner foundations that would gird people to make the social justice, racial justice movement possible. And so Howard you know, in terms of a luminary, Howard taught Vincent, Howard taught Martin, Howard taught Benjamin Mays. There's a lot of great stuff there, and I'm really pleased that in one of my upcoming books, I'm going to get a chance to write about that.
Thank you.
You know, one of the things you're bringing up, Jennifer, that I wanted to jump on is that, you know, we talk about the importance. Eliade talks about the fact that we live into our myths, right? We follow our myths. For example, Alexander the Great patterning after Achilles or something like this, right? Well, when I'm in Birmingham and I'm meeting with a lot of the people that I like in Birmingham, there's a sense of, there's a real desire for a new myth. Like it's kind of like palpable, you know, a lot of people, you know, would like to get past a kind of myth that they've been in. And that's a really complicated thing. And I don't think anybody's really sorted it out. And that's why there's, you know, there's a sticky and difficult place. But I wonder if you have any thoughts about, you know, we've talked about the importance of finding myths that can be healing patterns for us. And, you know, I just thought, you know, what Jennifer was bringing up about the importance of, you know, white people maybe finding a more healing myth or a more healing narrative in this shared story. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, I can say this, Will, if you're asking me, is that you don't just decide to create a new myth and everybody then kind of jumps on the bandwagon. As you know, myths emerge from a collective experience. What did Campbell say? Myths are personal dreams and myths are collective dreams and dreams are personal myths. And so I do agree with you that a new myth needs to emerge. It can't be the myth that dominated those folks who invaded the Capitol on January 6th. I think elements of that myth may already be there, and we, as people of good conscience and goodwill, need to seize on the elements of that myth that are already with us. You know, I'm thinking, for example, of a myth that starts with the view of the world from outer space. And there you've got a view in which you can identify based on color and you can identify based on boundaries. You've got this blue marble, pretty fragile, floating in a dark sky. And there's a lot within just that view, which we could describe as mythic. And I know I'm not the only one to have said this, but there is an example of maybe a place to start for folks who want to look at bringing forward a myth that might be more healthy for us as a society and as a country. So I think it's not a question of creating the new myth. I think it's probably a question of finding where that myth is beginning to give expression and amplifying the way that it's giving expression.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Well, Clyde, it seems that a belief system is an early stepping stone to forming a worldview, that the myth is underneath the worldview, perhaps at an unconscious level. And it may stem from characterization of a hero, or it may stem from the need for somebody. And Jennifer, I'm so glad to hear the bark at your end that your dog is okay. Her dog had a diagnosis today, and I'm glad that she's okay. But that I'm concerned that we have polarized views in our culture today, that there are belief systems that they're not that they're the myths are incompatible with one another, but the beliefs are. And the beliefs really go to authoring people's behaviors, giving them confidences that they wouldn't otherwise have. And I'm hurt by that. You know, I'm hurt that we have families that have people within them that we can't talk with, or it's difficult to talk with, or relations down the street that we have difficulty talking with. because I think we share a common myth, but we have different characters within the myth. And they just have formed a different worldview. And how do we get to a place where we can heal one another and participate in a field of harmony? Like Rumi says, meet you out in the field, I'll meet you there, you know?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing, you know, as I listen to you talk, Dana, and I'm sure Connie might have something to say about this, is I've always been of the belief that myths arise and can arise both from our shadow side and our light side. And I think you see the myths arising from the shadow side manifesting themselves in places like Washington on January 6th. So myths are powerful, and you can see the power that myths hold when they arise from the shadow side in terms of the folks who did attack the Capitol, and how people who understand that can encourage that myth and foment and support that myth. I'm not sure you fight a myth with another myth. I think you may allow yourself to live in the truth of a myth that you know comes from a place that is more wholesome, more healthy, more whole. And it is only in that way that you can represent who you are in response to those folks who may be living out a myth from their shadow. I don't think you can just beat down another myth, because myths, regardless of where they come from, they're just goddamn powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's up to us to live out a myth that has meaning to it. As somebody just asked the question, you know, I think it was Will, how do you discover and find a myth that makes sense in this world? I think as you do that, you, in a sense, may be able to drown out, and I'm just using kind of pulling out from the ether there some words, but you may be able to drown out that alternate myth that comes from the shadow side. I don't think you can fight it out. I don't believe that there's anything in our history that shows, other than extreme violence and the subjugation of someone, when you resort to the violent clash of mythologies. I mean, basically, that's the history of religion, right? My mythology says this. Oh, no, wait a minute. Your religion is actually a mythology, but my religion is the truth. I mean, that's essentially what goes on in the West. Of course, if you asked me, maybe after I'd had a little bit to drink, I might tell you that maybe we shouldn't allow any of the great religious traditions of the West to have as much power as they do, because they might be the source ultimately of some of the worst myths that allow us to prosecute violence against other people. You know, my God's better than your God. No, my God's better than your God. Well, I'll kill you. And in the history of humanity, more people, I don't have to tell you this, have been killed in the name of God than for any other cause on earth. And really, if you follow back even the myths right now from the dark side, those are myths ultimately based on, I think, an errant belief in religion that we have today.
Thanks for that. You know, I think everybody tends to live through the lens that they're a protagonist, or typically, unless they're living in the lens of being a victim. But what happens when you antagonize a protagonist?
Yeah, they react.
That's exactly what's going to happen. And so I think what you're saying, I think the Quakers are onto something when they're saying you can't really face evil down. You let evil defeat itself. Although there are some times that doesn't seem like enough, and it doesn't seem urgent enough either. So I'm not sure I'm ever left with really clear answers on what to do. And I hope I can find that center that you're talking about, but or at least anchor it as firmly as you have. But I do believe that engaging it and thinking about it like we have, like Socrates would, landing at the end of the day with a lot of open questions, but a lot of deeper perspectives, you know, is about as best as we can do.
You know, I'm also going to go back to something that, you know, King said, believed, practiced, and trained people. We trained people in the freedom struggle to do with the spiritual center. And that is, if you remember what happened in the 60s, King specifically, and this again comes from not from Gandhi, but even older traditions than that. The whole idea was you evoke, not intentionally, but just by your presence and not being moved, you will evoke the animosity, the violence, the perpetuation of oppression by the forces that you wish to change. And you have to realize that that's the only way that you get that change. You don't try to engage them directly in battle. You simply are there standing in your truth, and just standing in your truth evokes them to react in such a way that the violence and the insanity is so obvious that change happens. I mean, that's the fundamental basis of the Black freedom struggle and its history again in nonviolent movements, that nonviolence is not passive, and it's not even always that nonviolent, because it evokes the violence of the side that would oppose it. And King was very clear about that, which again is why you can't ask people to go into that place without giving them a spiritual center that allows them to realize what they are going to face, from billy clubs to dogs to water cannons in the 60s to rubber bullets, pepper spray, and tanks in the in our current time.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
Clyde, like many of the myth salons, we come full tilt at the very end up to this kind of wall of time and find ourselves, well, we want more, but the ritual says this is where it has to end. And I really want to thank you for your gracious and enthusiastic participation in the Myth Salon and the kindest comments. And I want to go around the panel and thank Selina and Dennis and Dara and Jennifer and Vorris and Connie and Zaman. And just for the generosity of your spirit and your questions, and thank everybody who was in the audience or is still in the audience. We have a huge audience out there still. The chat box has been nonstop. Poor AJ has just been handling this, just going mad over there with references and links and connecting people. What a vital evening. And Clyde, thank you very much. I would like to take it out with a moment of silence that allows us to reflect back into the evening and back into the culture that we are in, and try to separate the meaningful sounds from the noise, and use this moment of silence to just, center ourselves. We may never get to the still point of the silence, but it's the only pursuit that is really worth taking. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for this wonderful Myth Salon. And Clyde, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And again, panel, wonderful. Thank you very much.
Look forward to next month or next 2 weeks from now. See you then. Thanks, Vorris. Thanks, Dennis.